On May 25, 1979, Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was bustling as usual, with travelers preparing for Memorial Day weekend getaways. Among them were 258 passengers and 13 crew members aboard American Airlines Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 scheduled to fly to Los Angeles. At first glance, it seemed like any other flight, routine, smooth, and perfectly ordinary. But within moments of takeoff, that sense of normalcy shattered into one of the most devastating tragedies in U.S. aviation history. At 3:02 p.m., Flight 191 began its takeoff roll down runway 32R. Just as the aircraft was lifting off, the left engine suddenly separated from the wing, flipping over the top and tearing away part of the wing's leading edge in the process. To the average observer, it looked like the engine had just peeled off and tumbled away, a deeply unsettling sight that was unfortunately only the beginning. The engine loss wasn't just a matter of thrust. It severed critical hydraulic and electrical systems as well. The aircraft, now crippled and unbalanced, rolled sharply to the left just seconds after liftoff, stalled, and crashed in a fiery explosion into a nearby open field and trailer park. All 271 people on board were killed instantly, along with 2 individuals on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident on American soil, and the images of the smoking wreckage left a haunting impression on the nation. The horror wasn't just in the loss of life, it was in the speed at which everything fell apart, and in the eerie fact that the crash was captured on film by a plane spotter who had been watching from a nearby parking lot. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the engine detachment. Initially, suspicions ranged from bird strikes to manufacturing defects, but the truth was more complex and more unsettling. American Airlines had been using a maintenance shortcut, removing the engine and pylon together as a unit using a forklift rather than separately as recommended. This risky method, although it saved time, put immense pressure on the pylon mount, causing tiny cracks that eventually led to catastrophic failure. Essentially, the engine tore itself away because of a shortcut that had gone unnoticed and uncorrected. The Federal Aviation Administration responded by grounding the entire fleet of DC-10s in the U.S., which caused public panic and massive disruptions. McDonnell Douglas, the aircraft's manufacturer, faced intense scrutiny, even though the fault ultimately lay in maintenance procedures rather than the design itself. The crash of Flight 191 became a defining moment in aviation safety, prompting stricter regulations, tighter oversight, and a renewed emphasis on doing things by the book, especially when lives are at stake. Even decades later, Flight 191 is remembered not just for the tragic scale of its loss, but for how it exposed cracks, both literal and metaphorical, in the system. Memorials have been erected near the crash site, and every year, loved ones gather to honor those who lost their lives in a tragedy that could have been prevented. It's a painful reminder that in aviation, even the smallest shortcut can have the gravest consequences, and that safety is always written in lives, not just regulations. On December 25, 2024, what should have been a routine flight turned into a disaster. Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, an Embraer 190, departed from Baku, Azerbaijan, bound for Grozny, Russia, carrying 67 people, minus 62 passengers and 5 crew members. Within 2 hours, tragedy would unfold, leaving 38 dead and 29 forever changed. The flight took off on schedule that Christmas morning. Weather conditions were less than ideal, but still within acceptable limits. For the first 40 minutes, all was calm. Captain Igor Shakin and First Officer Alexander Konov, both seasoned pilots, kept the flight steady while Chief Flight Attendant Hakuma Aleva and her team ensured passenger comfort. Trouble began as the aircraft neared Russian airspace. Suddenly, the GPS navigation system failed. Experts would later determine the likely cause: military-grade GPS jamming, a known issue in geopolitically tense areas. Though unsettling, the pilots continued, switching to backup navigation systems. Russian air traffic control gave clearance to land at Grine, but a heavy fog blanketing the airport made visibility nearly impossible. After 2 aborted landing attempts, the pilots made the decision to turn back to Baku, but as the plane reversed course, 81 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. A sudden explosion shook the fuselage, followed by chaos. Passengers screamed, oxygen masks deployed, and debris tore through the cabin. Flight attendant Aiden Rahim would later describe the moment as pure terror. A second explosion ripped through the aircraft, injuring flight attendant Zulfugar Asadov, who continued assisting passengers despite being wounded. At first, the crew suspected a bird strike or engine malfunction, but with systems rapidly failing and the plane becoming harder to control, they realized this was far more serious. The pilots turned the aircraft toward Owa, Kazakhstan, hoping to make an emergency landing. As they crossed the Caspian Sea, the aircraft's altitude and speed fluctuated dangerously. They attempted to land at Owa International Airport. On their first pass, visibility and control problems forced a go-around. On the second attempt, the plane never made it. Just 3 kilometers from the runway, the right wing clipped the ground. The aircraft broke apart, tumbling across a field before bursting into flames. The crash site was horrific. Flames, smoke, and twisted metal scattered across the field. Emergency responders worked frantically, pulling injured survivors from the wreckage. One video showed a woman crying out for help, trapped under debris. Of the 67 aboard, 38 were killed, including both pilots and chief flight attendant Aliva. Her final words over the intercom were, "Everything will be fine." Her family later said she died doing what she loved, caring for others. The 29 survivors suffered broken bones, burns, and deep psychological scars. Among them were 2 children, both traumatized but alive. As investigators combed through the site, they made a shocking discovery: missile fragments near the wreckage. Analysis pointed to a surface-to-air missile, likely from a Panzer S-1 defense system. Survivors had heard multiple blasts before the aircraft lost control. Initially, Russia denied any involvement, but under growing international pressure, the Kremlin issued a statement of regret, calling it a tragic incident. Though never officially confirmed, the evidence strongly indicated a mistaken military strike. For the victims and survivors, that Christmas Day became a haunting symbol of how quickly ordinary life can turn to catastrophe, especially in the shadow of global tensions. In the early hours of June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the world stunned and aviation experts scrambling for answers. The Airbus A330 had departed from Rio de Janeiro en route to Paris, carrying 228 passengers and crew. The flight began routinely, cruising smoothly above the Atlantic under the command of an experienced crew and equipped with modern systems. But in the darkness of night and deep within a remote stretch of ocean, things took a devastating turn. As the aircraft entered a region known for volatile weather near the equator, it encountered a series of towering thunderclouds, common but dangerous features in the intertropical convergence zone. The plane's pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, began to ice over. These small but essential sensors are critical for providing accurate data to the flight computers and pilots. As they became blocked with ice, the airspeed readings turned unreliable, causing the autopilot to disconnect. In that moment, the smooth ride became a high-stakes test of skill and judgment. With the autopilot off, the co-pilot at the controls reacted by pulling the nose of the aircraft upward. This might seem instinctive, but at high altitude, such a move can lead to an aerodynamic stall, a condition where the wings lose lift and the plane begins to fall. The cockpit filled with warning tones and confusing alerts. The stall alarm sounded repeatedly, but the pilots failed to recognize the nature of the problem. The aircraft, instead of leveling out, continued to pitch upward, bleeding speed and lift. For more than 3 minutes, the jet descended in a stalled condition, falling from the sky at a terrifying rate, while the crew struggled to make sense of what was happening. Despite having time and altitude to recover, the lack of clear situational awareness, combined with insufficient training in manual high-altitude stall recovery, sealed the fate of the flight. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, the plane struck the ocean surface with tremendous force, killing all 228 people on board. The wreckage was scattered across the ocean floor, nearly 4,000 meters deep, in one of the most inaccessible regions of the Atlantic. Initial search efforts recovered only a small portion of the debris, and the flight recorders remained lost for nearly 2 years. When they were finally retrieved in 2011, the world learned the grim details of the final moments. The investigation revealed a cascade of errors. The iced pitot tubes were the initial trigger, but it was human error that ultimately caused the crash. The pilot's lack of understanding of the stall, compounded by poor coordination and communication in the cockpit, led to a series of incorrect actions. The aircraft was fully functional and could have been flown to safety, but confusion and misinterpretation of the situation led to a catastrophic outcome. In the aftermath, the aviation industry took several hard lessons to heart. Air France and other airlines revised training protocols, particularly in manual flying skills and high-altitude stall recovery. The design of pitot tubes was improved to better resist icing. Cockpit communication procedures were also reassessed to emphasize clearer roles and more assertive decision-making in emergencies. Air France Flight 447 was a sobering reminder that even the most advanced aircraft are not immune to human vulnerability. It highlighted how, in moments of crisis, technology alone cannot substitute for understanding, experience, and communication. The tragedy reshaped aviation safety, leaving behind a legacy of reforms aimed at preventing such a disaster from ever happening again. On October 13, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D carrying 45 people, including a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and family took off with high spirits and dreams of playing a match in Chile. But somewhere over the Andes, disaster struck. Due to bad weather and a tragic navigation error, the plane crashed violently into the mountains, instantly killing 12 passengers and leaving the rest stranded in a frozen wasteland at 12,000 feet. With no rescue in sight, freezing temperatures, and minimal supplies, the survivors were thrust into a nightmare few could even imagine. They huddled together for warmth inside the broken fuselage, hoping each sunrise would bring helicopters and salvation. But after 10 days, a heartbreaking radio announcement shattered that hope. The search had been called off. Faced with starvation, the survivors made a harrowing decision that would shock the world. They would survive by consuming the bodies of those who had died. It was not a choice made lightly, but one of necessity, driven by the overwhelming instinct to live. As if their ordeal couldn't get worse, an avalanche struck their shelter on the 17th day, burying the wreckage and killing 8 more people. The survivors now faced the Andes not only with grief and guilt, but with dwindling strength and hope. Realizing that waiting any longer meant certain death, 2 of the strongest men, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, set out to do the unthinkable. Crossed the mountains on foot, with almost no gear and suffering from weeks of starvation. They hiked for 10 days across steep, snow-covered terrain, enduring unimaginable hardship. At last, they encountered a Chilean shepherd across a river and managed to get a message across. This moment marked the turning point. Rescue helicopters were dispatched, and on December 23rd, 72 grueling days after the crash, the remaining 16 survivors were airlifted to safety. What the rescuers found was beyond belief: a group of emaciated, frost-bitten souls who had endured one of the most harrowing survival stories ever recorded. The world was stunned as details emerged. While some headlines sensationalized cannibalism, the deeper truth was one of unimaginable human resilience. These young men had faced death daily, and yet they clung to life with a strength that defied the elements and the odds. In time, the survivors shared their story openly, not to glorify suffering, but to speak honestly about courage, unity, and the difficult moral lines drawn in extreme situations. Books like Alive by Piers Paul Read and documentaries such as Stranded and Society of the Snow have told their story with the depth and emotion it deserves. For many of the survivors, the Andes crash was not just a tragic memory, but a turning point that defined the rest of their lives. It remains one of the most powerful examples of human survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. The story of Flight 571 is a haunting reminder that sometimes, even in the most unforgiving corners of the world, the will to live can push us beyond what we ever believed possible. On August 14th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca, Cyprus, heading for Prague with a scheduled layover in Athens. What should have been a typical flight turned into one of aviation's most chilling disasters. Only moments after departure, a chain of preventable mistakes began turning the aircraft into a flying coffin. Soon after takeoff, the plane suffered a pressurization failure. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the cabin pressure system had been left in manual mode following a maintenance check and was never switched back to automatic. As the jet climbed into thinner air, the system failed to adjust the internal pressure, which should have remained at a safe, breathable level. At around 16,000 feet, the captain noticed unusual warning signals and contacted Helios's operations center, reporting what he believed were air conditioning problems. During a confusing exchange, engineers suggested reviewing the pressurization settings, but the advice wasn't fully understood. With the pressure dropping and oxygen thinning fast, neither the captain nor his co-pilot identified the real issue in time. By the time the aircraft reached 28,900 feet, all radio contact had ceased. The crew and passengers were slipping into unconsciousness, victims of hypoxia, a condition caused by lack of oxygen. At 34,000 feet, emergency oxygen masks dropped, but in the freezing cabin, where temperatures outside reached minus 50 degrees Celsius, it's unclear how many were able to use them. Inside the cockpit, both pilots were incapacitated. The co-pilot was slumped over and the captain's seat sat empty. With the plane now flying solely on autopilot, it continued on its programmed course, completely unmanned. Greek air traffic controllers tried and failed to re-establish communication as the jet drifted toward Athens. By 11:05 a.m., the Greek military scrambled two F-16s to intercept the Boeing 737. When the fighter jets approached, what they saw was horrifying. A lifeless co-pilot, dangling oxygen masks, and a motionless cabin. Then at 11:49, they witnessed something extraordinary. Flight attendant Andreas Prodromou entered the cockpit and took the captain's seat. Andreas had survived the hypoxia thanks to a portable oxygen tank. Despite only limited flight training, he attempted to save the aircraft and everyone on board. He managed to disengage autopilot and begin a descent. One of the fighter pilots reported seeing him briefly wave before one of the engines cut out due to fuel exhaustion. With the left engine gone, the plane began spiraling out of its holding pattern. 10 minutes later, the right engine failed as well. Out of fuel and with no remaining oxygen, Andreas eventually lost consciousness. At 12:03 p.m., Flight 522 crashed into a hillside near Grammatico, about 25 miles north of Athens, erupting in flames. All 121 people aboard perished, minus 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Forensic teams later determined many had still been alive but unconscious at the moment of impact. Most bodies were found strapped to their seats, frozen solid. Among the victims was the Sharupa family. Demos, who had returned to Cyprus from Australia, died along with his wife Margarita and their daughters, Sophia and Diana. Their youngest child, George, only 2 years old, had stayed behind with family and became the sole survivor of his household. Dubbed the ghost plane by the media, the crash shocked the world. Investigators traced the cause to human error, a maintenance oversight, and a fatal misunderstanding by the crew. Though several officials were eventually convicted of manslaughter by negligence, the emotional toll remains immeasurable. Andreas's final brave attempt may have prevented the aircraft from crashing into a populated area. His courage, though ultimately not enough to save those on board, likely spared countless lives on the ground. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 left Tokyo's Haneda Airport for what was supposed to be a short and uneventful flight to Osaka. It was a routine domestic trip, something the airline had done countless times before without incident. The aircraft, a Boeing 747SR, was a specially modified version of the jumbo jet designed for short-haul, high-capacity flights within Japan. On board were 524 people, mostly families returning home, business travelers heading to meetings, and a dedicated crew guiding them through what should have been a simple journey from point A to point B. But about 12 minutes after takeoff, the ordinary became unthinkable. At 6:24 p.m., a loud bang shattered the usual hum of the engines and the relative calm of the cabin. The rear pressure bulkhead, an essential structural component that keeps the aircraft pressurized at altitude, had suddenly failed. What followed was an explosive decompression that tore through the tail of the aircraft. In an instant, the vertical stabilizer, essentially the plane's steering fin, was ripped clean off. To make matters worse, the explosion severed all 4 of the plane's hydraulic systems, the systems responsible for moving the control surfaces. In simple terms, the plane had no way to steer or stabilize itself. The root cause of the disaster traced back to a repair made 7 years earlier, after the plane had suffered a tail strike upon landing. The bulkhead had been improperly repaired by using a single row of rivets instead of the required double row. This flawed fix created a weak point in the structure. For years, it silently endured the stress of repeated pressurization cycles until that fateful evening when it finally gave way. With the aircraft severely crippled, the flight crew, led by Captain Masami Takahama, faced an almost impossible situation. Deprived of traditional flight controls, they attempted to steer using nothing but engine thrust, powering up one side to turn and easing off the other to adjust direction. This technique, known as differential thrust control, is extraordinarily difficult and rarely practiced outside of simulators. But somehow, they managed to keep the aircraft flying, barely, for another 32 minutes. Their efforts were nothing short of heroic, showcasing remarkable skill, discipline, and composure under unimaginable pressure. During those 32 minutes, the aircraft flew in wild, looping patterns over the mountainous terrain of central Japan. Air traffic control remained in contact with the crew, though the situation remained dire. Fighter jets were scrambled and caught glimpses of the struggling jumbo jet, but they were unable to assist. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. The plane was violently shaking, pitching and rolling unpredictably, and many passengers understood that the situation was desperate. Some began writing farewell letters to loved ones, scrawling notes on air sickness bags, tray tables, and whatever paper they could find. At 6:56 p.m., the aircraft could no longer sustain flight. It crashed into the rugged face of Mount Takamagahara in the Ueno area of Gunma Prefecture. The impact was catastrophic. Of the 524 people on board, only 4 survived, all women seated near the rear of the plane. Miraculously, one of them was a 12-year-old girl. Rescue operations were hampered by communication breakdowns and the challenging terrain. Tragically, the delay meant that several passengers who might have survived the crash succumbed to their injuries before help could arrive. The crash of Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history. It left an indelible mark on Japan and the global aviation community. Boeing eventually took responsibility for the flawed repair guidelines that contributed to the disaster. The tragedy prompted sweeping reforms in aircraft maintenance protocols, repair certification processes, and emergency response coordination. To this day, the crash is remembered not only for its massive loss of life, but for the extraordinary efforts of a flight crew who fought to the very end to save their passengers. It stands as a powerful reminder that in aviation, every detail matters, and that the smallest oversight can lead to the most devastating consequences. On the morning of August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Athens, Greece, with 121 people on board, a mix of vacationers, families, and crew looking forward to an ordinary day. But what followed was anything but ordinary. Shortly after takeoff, a small but deadly error began to unfold. The aircraft's pressurization system, which should have been set to automatic, had mistakenly been left on manual after a routine maintenance check. This meant that as the plane climbed higher, the cabin failed to properly pressurize. Within minutes, the air inside the aircraft grew dangerously thin. Alarms started sounding in the cockpit, but tragically, the crew misinterpreted them. The warning horn that blared, meant to indicate cabin pressure problems, was identical to the one for takeoff configuration errors. In the chaos and confusion, the pilots didn't realize they were slowly succumbing to hypoxia, a silent and creeping condition where the brain and body are starved of oxygen. As they lost consciousness, so did the rest of the people on board, one by one, until the plane was flying completely unresponsive on autopilot, a ghost in the sky. For the next 2 hours, the aircraft silently cruised over Greek airspace, completely out of contact. Greek fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the wayward 737, and what they saw was chilling. The cockpit windows were frosted over. The captain appeared slumped at the controls. Oxygen masks were hanging down inside the cabin, but no one was moving. It was clear to everyone watching from the ground and the sky that something had gone terribly wrong, but in a surprising twist, movement was suddenly spotted. Someone was alive. A flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou, one of the few people who had managed to put on an oxygen mask in time, had regained partial consciousness. Trained as a flight attendant and with some pilot experience, he made a heroic effort to save the aircraft. He fought his way to the cockpit, past unconscious passengers and low oxygen levels, and tried to take control. For a brief moment, the plane showed signs of manual input, a last-ditch effort to steer the doomed flight, but sadly, it was too late. With fuel nearly exhausted, the engines flamed out and the aircraft began to descend uncontrollably. At 12:04 p.m., it crashed into the hills near Grammatico, Greece, killing all on board. The investigation that followed uncovered a chain of small but fatal oversights: the switch in the wrong setting, the failure to recognize the hypoxia symptoms, and the confusion caused by identical warning sounds. Helios Airways and its procedures came under intense scrutiny, as did the design of the aircraft's alert systems. One of the most debated issues was how such a preventable technical oversight, a simple switch, could lead to a full-scale aviation disaster. The incident exposed how fragile safety can be when training gaps, mechanical oversight, and human error line up perfectly in the wrong way. In the aftermath, Boeing made changes to cockpit warning systems, and airlines worldwide reviewed pressurization training. But the tragedy of Flight 522 remains a haunting reminder of how silence in the skies can signal something far more sinister. A plane full of people, drifting on autopilot, unconscious and unreachable. It wasn't just a crash. It was a slow, quiet unraveling of life at 34000 feet, and the image of fighter pilots helplessly watching from the outside, unable to intervene, only adds to the heartbreak. Sometimes the scariest thing in aviation isn't the noise, it's the silence. On January 31st, 2000, Alaska Airlines Flight 261 took off from Puerto Vallarta on what was supposed to be a routine flight to Seattle, with a planned stop in San Francisco. But within hours, the trip turned into one of the most heartbreaking aviation disasters in U.S. history. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, left the airport at 1:37 p.m. with 83 passengers and 5 crew members on board. Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Tansky, both highly experienced pilots, were in control. Not long into the flight, they encountered a technical issue with the plane's horizontal stabilizer, a vital component responsible for controlling the pitch of the aircraft. It wasn't moving as it should. The autopilot was disengaged, and the crew began flying manually while troubleshooting the issue. At this point, they hadn't declared an emergency, but Captain Thompson asked to divert to Los Angeles out of caution. At cruising altitude near 26,000 feet, the unthinkable happened. The aircraft suddenly pitched downward. Unknown to those on board, the jack screw assembly that managed the stabilizer had failed. Investigators would later find it had worn down due to poor maintenance and insufficient lubrication, a preventable and known problem. The pilots managed to pull the plane out of the first dive, regaining some control, and asked for an open stretch of ocean airspace to attempt different landing setups. But hope was short-lived. A second, more catastrophic failure occurred. The stabilizer jammed again, and this time the aircraft rolled upside down. It plummeted in an unrecoverable nose-down, losing power. At 4:21 p.m., the MD-83 slammed into the Pacific Ocean off the California coast at over 300 miles per hour. Rescue and recovery efforts launched immediately. Navy and Coast Guard crews scoured the ocean with sonar, submersibles, and ships near Anacapa Island. Wreckage and bodies were scattered across the water. Flight recorders recovered from the deep confirmed the horror. 9 minutes of chaos, courage, and helplessness. Among the 88 victims were entire families. David and Carolyn Clemenson, along with their children, Coriander, Blake, Miles, and baby Spencer, died together. Their neighbors and close friends, the Pearsons, also perished. Parents and daughters, Rachel and Grace. 2 Seattle communities were left devastated, mourning multiple families at once. Also on board were Redmond residents Terry and Barbara Ryan, their sons James and Bradford Pat, and friends who had joined the trip to celebrate Jim's 30th birthday and Pat's recent college graduation. Jim, a flight attendant, was working that flight. A family friend described them as a tight-knit, joyful group who lived to support one another. Alaska Airlines employees Craig and Paul Polano, known for their contagious humor and festive holiday decorations, were lost too. So were wine columnist Tom Stockley and his wife Peggy, who had left behind a handwritten note for her elderly mother, discovered days later one last echo of love. These weren't just passengers. They were people full of life, children, parents, professionals, friends. Their deaths struck a national nerve not only because of the scale of loss, but because the crash was avoidable. Neglected maintenance triggered a series of mechanical failures that ended 88 lives in mere minutes. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophe built on warnings ignored and families left forever changed. The Tenerife airport disaster, which took place on March 27, 1977, remains the deadliest aviation accident in history, a title no one ever wants to hold. It happened at Los Rodeos Airport, now Tenerife North Airport, in the Canary Islands, when two massive Boeing 747s, one from KLM and the other from Pan American World Airways, tragically collided on the runway in dense fog, resulting in the loss of 583 lives. What makes this disaster even more haunting is that it wasn't caused by a mechanical failure or bad weather alone, but by a tragic sequence of miscommunication, assumptions, and bad timing that spiraled into the worst-case scenario. At the time, Los Rodeos was never meant to be hosting such a crowd. A terrorist bombing at nearby Gran Canaria Airport had forced dozens of incoming flights to divert to this much smaller, fog-prone airfield. As a result, the runway and taxiways were congested with parked planes and stressed crews, all waiting for clearance to depart. The weather then decided to make things even more complicated by rolling in thick fog, limiting visibility to just a few hundred feet. It was under these already tense and confusing conditions that the KLM and Pan Am flights began preparing for takeoff. Both aircraft were on the same runway. KLM had lined up, waiting to take off, while Pan Am was taxiing ahead, trying to find the right exit. Due to the poor visibility, the crews couldn't see each other, and neither could the control tower. That's where communication became absolutely critical, and unfortunately, where it also began to unravel. The KLM captain, a highly experienced pilot, misunderstood a transmission from air traffic control as a takeoff clearance. Confident he had permission to depart, he powered up the engines and began his takeoff roll. Meanwhile, the Pan Am plane was still taxiing slowly ahead on the same runway, unaware of the impending danger behind them. The result was catastrophic. By the time the Pan Am crew spotted the KLM jet barreling toward them through the fog, there was no time to react. The two aircraft collided at high speed, tearing through each other and igniting a massive fireball. The KLM plane became airborne for just a moment before crashing back down, while the Pan Am jet was torn apart. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the fire and wreckage made rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Only 61 people survived, all from the Pan Am flight. Everyone aboard the KLM aircraft was killed. In the aftermath, investigators were determined to figure out how such a terrible miscommunication could occur. It became clear that a combination of ambiguous radio messages, assumptions by the flight crew, and the lack of visual confirmation led to the disaster. One major issue was the use of non-standard language between pilots and air traffic control. Phrases like, "We are at takeoff," were misinterpreted, and important confirmations weren't repeated or clarified. The aviation industry responded swiftly. One of the most significant outcomes was the global adoption of standard phraseology, a set of clear, concise, and universally understood phrases used in all aviation communication. Pilots and controllers were trained to use precise language, always confirming and repeating instructions. Additionally, the importance of crew resource management, CRM, gained attention, emphasizing teamwork, communication, and assertiveness within the cockpit, regardless of hierarchy. While the Tenerife disaster remains a deeply painful chapter in aviation history, it also became a catalyst for sweeping changes in airline operations and safety culture. The lessons learned have saved countless lives since. Today, commercial aviation is safer than ever, and much of that progress can be traced back to the hard lessons learned on that foggy runway in Tenerife. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 took off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, bound for Kuala Lumpur. It was supposed to be a routine, long-haul flight over Europe and Asia, a quiet 12 hours in the sky, with movies, meals, and mild turbulence. But somewhere over eastern Ukraine, cruising at 33,000 feet, everything changed in an instant. The plane vanished from radar, and before anyone could even grasp what had happened, debris was raining down over fields and villages near Hrabov, in a war-torn region embroiled in a bitter conflict between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. All 298 people on board, passengers and crew, were killed. No distress call, no warning, just silence and smoke. What followed was a global outcry, a political mess, and one of the most intense international investigations the aviation world had ever seen. Almost immediately, suspicion pointed toward a surface-to-air missile, a Russian-made Buk system. It didn't take long before intelligence agencies, satellite images, and social media posts painted a picture. A missile launcher had been moved across the Russian border into separatist-held territory that day, and later returned, suspiciously, one missile short. The Dutch-led joint investigation team took the lead, combing through wreckage, tracking military hardware, analyzing flight paths, and even studying intercepted phone calls. What they found was damning. The missile was fired from an area controlled by pro-Russian fighters, using equipment traced back to a Russian military unit. It wasn't just an accident, it was a catastrophic mistake with geopolitical consequences. The passengers on board came from all over the world: the Netherlands, Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia, the UK, Germany, and several other countries. Among them were families, students, tourists, and researchers. There was even a large group of AIDS researchers heading to an international conference. Their loss was felt not just in their home countries, but globally. Grief turned into outrage. Governments demanded accountability. Russia, for its part, denied involvement, dismissed the investigation as biased, and pushed alternate theories, none of which held up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, images of teddy bears scattered in sunflower fields and the charred remains of the aircraft circulated widely, symbolizing the horror of war spilling into civilian life. In 2022, a Dutch court finally handed down its verdict. 3 men, 2 Russian nationals, and a Ukrainian separatist were convicted in absentia of murder and causing the crash. They were linked directly to the missile launcher and its deployment. The verdict didn't bring back the victims, but it offered some closure to the families. It also sent a message that even in the fog of war, justice might still find a way. More recently, in 2025, the International Civil Aviation Organization concluded that Russia violated international aviation law, further solidifying global consensus on the state's indirect responsibility. Separately, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russia bore legal responsibility for the attack, adding yet another layer of international condemnation. What makes the MH17 tragedy stand out isn't just the scale of the loss or the political tension it stirred up, it's how clearly it showed the danger of modern conflicts overlapping with global air travel. It was a harsh reminder that war zones and commercial flight paths don't mix. Airliners full of innocent civilians don't belong in anyone's crosshairs. And yet, on that day in July, one did. The legacy of MH17 is still unfolding in courtrooms and diplomatic halls, but its human cost is eternal. Families were torn apart, lives were cut short, and a routine flight turned into a tragedy that circled the globe. There was no time to react, no second chance. Just one missile, one moment, and a sky that should have been safe, but wasn't. On October 13, 1972, a chartered plane went down deep in the Andes Mountains, sparking one of the most extraordinary and terrifying survival stories ever told. The aircraft, a Fairchild FH-227D, was flying from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile when disaster struck. What started as a routine flight turned into a nightmare at 3,600 meters above sea level in sub-zero conditions. On board were 45 people, including players from the old Christians Club rugby team, along with their friends, family, and supporters. From the outset, the odds were stacked against them. The plane was overloaded and underpowered, forced to navigate unstable weather over one of the world's highest mountain ranges. After being delayed overnight in Argentina, the plane took off the next afternoon. But as it approached the Andes, co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguarara misjudged their position, thinking they had passed the Chilean town of Curaçao. He began a descent far too early, while the aircraft was still deep in the mountains. Moments later, the plane slammed into a ridge. The crash was devastating. The wings and tail broke off immediately, and the fuselage rocketed down a glacier at more than 350 kilometers per hour before it finally came to a violent stop. 12 people died instantly or within hours, including the pilot, Colonel Helios Cesar Ferradas, who was crushed on impact. Several passengers were flung from the wreckage. Among the survivors was 22-year-old Fernando Parado, who suffered a fractured skull and remained unconscious for 4 days. When he awoke, he was surrounded by death. His mother, sister, and many close friends were gone. The remaining 33 survivors were stranded in the frozen wilderness, completely cut off from the world. With no rescue in sight, they took shelter inside the wreckage. But food supplies were scarce and ran out within days. Nights were unbearably cold. They huddled together, punched each other to stay warm, and melted snow in bottles to drink. Their suffering grew worse when they heard, via a small transistor radio, that official search efforts had been called off after just 8 days. Facing starvation, the group made a grim and agonizing decision. They would survive by consuming the bodies of the dead. Many of them were deeply religious and only agreed after making a pact that their own bodies would be used if they didn't make it. Then disaster struck again. On day 17, an avalanche buried the fuselage, killing 8 more people. The survivors were trapped beneath snow, air running out. Parado managed to clear a hole in the cockpit, letting in enough oxygen to survive until the storm passed. Still, no help came. Weeks later, realizing they had no choice, they began planning an escape. Using the pilot's last known coordinates, they plotted a route west toward Chile. On December 12th, minus 61 days after the crash, Parado, Roberto Canessa, and another man set off into the mountains. They climbed Mount Sailor only to discover they were still deep in the Andes. The third man turned back, but Parado and Canessa pressed on, hiking nearly 54 kilometers over 7 grueling days. Eventually, they encountered a Chilean muleteer who understood their plight and sent for help. Parado and Canessa were rescued and taken to a nearby village where a recovery operation was launched. On December 22nd and 23rd, helicopters reached the crash site and rescued the 14 remaining survivors, minus 72 days after the crash. The ordeal made headlines worldwide, a powerful story of endurance and human will. Yet each survivor carried deep emotional wounds. For Fernando Parado, it wasn't just a tale of horror, but of friendship, courage, and the ultimate sacrifice that allowed him to live. On March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 was on its way from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. It seemed like any other routine flight, with passengers relaxing in their seats and the crew going through their usual pre-flight procedures. But the tragic events that followed would forever change the airline industry. The plane, an Airbus A320, was carrying 150 people when it suddenly crashed into the French Alps. The cause? A deliberate act by the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz. Here's where things take a chilling turn. When the captain briefly left the cockpit, Lubitz locked him out. The cockpit door was reinforced, making it impossible for the captain to regain access. Inside, Lubitz made a devastating decision. Rather than follow standard procedure, he intentionally set the autopilot to descend rapidly, sending the plane toward the mountains below. The cockpit voice recorder captured the captain's desperate attempts to re-enter, but Lubitz remained silent, and the plane continued its terrifying descent. The sound of the captain's frantic efforts to break the door open was captured on the recording, along with the unmistakable noise of the plane's fatal plunge. It was an unimaginable turn of events that no one could have predicted. What made this situation even more shocking was that Lubitz had a history of mental health issues, including depression, which he had kept hidden from his employer. Investigators later found that he had sought treatment for these issues and had even been deemed unfit to fly on some occasions, but he had continued to work as a pilot. It became clear that he had been struggling privately with these issues, and tragically that led to this fatal decision. Lubitz's actions raised uncomfortable questions about the role of mental health in aviation safety, particularly the extent to which employers are responsible for ensuring that their employees are fit to fly. The Germanwings crash sent shockwaves throughout the aviation community, leaving everyone from industry experts to the public grappling with the implications of such a senseless act. In the aftermath of the crash, the aviation world was shaken to its core. The incident prompted immediate changes in airline policies, most notably the implementation of the two-person rule. This new rule mandates that at least 2 crew members must be present in the cockpit at all times, whether it's the captain and co-pilot or the co-pilot and a flight attendant. The hope was that this would prevent something like this from ever happening again, ensuring that no one could be left alone in the cockpit with the ability to make such a tragic decision. The Germanwings crash left a lasting mark on the aviation community and raised questions about mental health awareness, pilot screening, and the responsibility of employers to ensure their staff is fit for duty. The tragedy is a stark reminder of how important it is to address mental health issues, particularly in high-stakes professions like aviation, where the safety of others is in the hands of one person. The crash also highlighted the need for better systems of support for those dealing with mental health challenges, especially when those individuals hold jobs that could impact the lives of hundreds of people at a time. In the end, the crash claimed the lives of all 150 people on board, leaving families and loved ones devastated. While changes were made in the wake of the incident, it's a painful reminder that sometimes even the most routine of flights can take an unimaginable turn. The Germanwings tragedy remains one of the most heart-wrenching moments in aviation history, and its lessons continue to shape the industry to this day. On the morning of August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Athens, Greece, with 121 people on board, a mix of vacationers, families, and crew looking forward to an ordinary day. But what followed was anything but ordinary. Shortly after takeoff, a small but deadly error began to unfold. The aircraft's pressurization system, which should have been set to automatic, had mistakenly been left on manual after a routine maintenance check. This meant that as the plane climbed higher, the cabin failed to properly pressurize. Within minutes, the air inside the aircraft grew dangerously thin. Alarms started sounding in the cockpit, but tragically, the crew misinterpreted them. The warning horn that blared, meant to indicate cabin pressure problems, was identical to the one for takeoff configuration errors. In the chaos and confusion, the pilots didn't realize they were slowly succumbing to hypoxia, a silent and creeping condition where the brain and body are starved of oxygen. As they lost consciousness, so did the rest of the people on board, one by one, until the plane was flying completely unresponsive on autopilot, a ghost in the sky. For the next 2 hours, the aircraft silently cruised over Greek airspace, completely out of contact. Greek fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the wayward 737, and what they saw was chilling. The cockpit windows were frosted over. The captain appeared slumped at the controls. Oxygen masks were hanging down inside the cabin, but no one was moving. It was clear to everyone watching from the ground and the sky that something had gone terribly wrong, but in a surprising twist, movement was suddenly spotted. Someone was alive. A flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou, one of the few people who had managed to put on an oxygen mask in time, had regained partial consciousness. Trained as a flight attendant and with some pilot experience, he made a heroic effort to save the aircraft. He fought his way to the cockpit, past unconscious passengers and low oxygen levels, and tried to take control. For a brief moment, the plane showed signs of manual input, a last-ditch effort to steer the doomed flight, but sadly, it was too late. With fuel nearly exhausted, the engines flamed out and the aircraft began to descend uncontrollably. At 12:04 p.m., it crashed into the hills near Grammatico, Greece, killing all on board. The investigation that followed uncovered a chain of small but fatal oversights: the switch in the wrong setting, the failure to recognize the hypoxia symptoms, and the confusion caused by identical warning sounds. Helios Airways and its procedures came under intense scrutiny, as did the design of the aircraft's alert systems. One of the most debated issues was how such a preventable technical oversight, a simple switch, could lead to a full-scale aviation disaster. The incident exposed how fragile safety can be when training gaps, mechanical oversight, and human error line up perfectly in the wrong way. In the aftermath, Boeing made changes to cockpit warning systems, and airlines worldwide reviewed pressurization training. But the tragedy of Flight 522 remains a haunting reminder of how silence in the skies can signal something far more sinister. A plane full of people, drifting on autopilot, unconscious and unreachable. It wasn't just a crash. It was a slow, quiet unraveling of life at 34000 feet, and the image of fighter pilots helplessly watching from the outside, unable to intervene, only adds to the heartbreak. Sometimes the scariest thing in aviation isn't the noise, it's the silence. On the night of January 29, 2025, tragedy unfolded in the skies above the Potomac River near Washington, D.C., when a mid-air collision between a passenger jet and a military helicopter claimed the lives of all 67 people aboard. The horrifying event stunned the nation and left a permanent scar on the capital's airspace. Flight 5342 had taken off from Wichita, Kansas, carrying 60 passengers and a crew of 4. It was nearing the end of its journey, just minutes from landing at Reagan National Airport, when the unthinkable happened. Simultaneously, a Black Hawk helicopter conducting a routine night vision training exercise was flying nearby, crewed by 3 personnel from Fort Belvoir. Both aircraft were in contact with air traffic control. Yet, somehow, a deadly chain of errors, a breach in restricted airspace, miscommunication, and radar blind spots led to the disaster. At 8:47 p.m., just hundreds of feet above the river and less than a mile from the runway, the 2 aircraft collided. A violent fireball erupted in the night sky, captured live by a riverfront webcam. The commercial jet, a 20-year-old regional aircraft, had recently been added to the Kansas, D.C. route. The Black Hawk, typically used to transport high-level government officials, was flying with no passengers, only its crew. Despite the vastly different missions, their paths fatally crossed. Among those lost on Flight 5342 were 28 individuals linked to the U.S. figure skating community. The group, including young athletes, coaches, and family members, had just attended the U.S. Figure Skating National Development Camp. Their dreams of Olympic glory were destroyed in an instant. The Skating Club of Boston suffered devastating losses, including talented teens Spencer Lane and Jenna Han, their mothers, and world-renowned Russian coaches Eva Shishkova and Vadim Nomov, who had devoted their post-competitive careers to mentoring American youth. The aircraft crew, too, left behind stories of dedication and hope. Captain Jonathan Campos, 34, was a seasoned pilot known for his focus and passion. His co-pilot, 28-year-old Sam Lilly, was newly engaged and had quickly gained respect within the airline. Flight attendants Ian Epstein, remembered for his joyful spirit, and Denasia Elder, a mother of 2 and beacon of strength for her family, were also lost. Other passengers included people like Grace Maxwell, a college student studying biomedical engineering, who had just returned from her grandfather's funeral. Lawyers Sarah Lee Best and Elizabeth Keyes, both known for their work in justice reform, were among the deceased, along with Howard University professor Kaya Duggins, a prominent civil rights attorney whose death sent shockwaves through the legal community. On board the Black Hawk were 3 military service members: Captain Rebecca Lobach, a 28-year-old night certification; Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Eves, 39, the evaluator overseeing the flight; and Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, 29, a new father whose loss left a young family grieving. In the aftermath, the National Transportation Safety Board released a preliminary report pointing to a dangerously narrow vertical gap between the helicopter's authorized air corridor and the jet's final descent path. The FAA was heavily criticized for failing to act on multiple past warnings of near misses in the same area. At the time of the crash, only one air traffic controller was overseeing both the helicopter and some fixed-wing traffic, a clear sign of systemic understaffing. By February 4th, recovery teams had retrieved the wreckage and identified all 67 victims. Across the country, grief and disbelief rippled through families, sports communities, and military circles. The legacy of this disaster is not just in the lives lost, but in the urgent call for change that must follow. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, heading for Beijing on what was supposed to be a routine red-eye flight. It was a quiet night with 239 people on board, passengers and crew settling in for the journey ahead. The plane, a Boeing 777, was one of the most reliable aircraft in the skies. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then, about 38 minutes after takeoff, the flight simply disappeared. At first, air traffic control lost contact. Not entirely unusual. Sometimes communications dip, but this wasn't just a blip. The plane's transponder, which communicates with radar systems, had gone dark. One moment it was there. The next, it was off the grid. As authorities scrambled, it was discovered that the aircraft had made a sharp left turn, doubling back over the Malaysian peninsula. From there, it veered off its flight path entirely, heading southwest into the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. What followed was one of the largest and most expensive search efforts in aviation history. Multiple countries joined the hunt. Ships, planes, satellites, all combed through thousands of square miles of ocean. But despite all the tech and teamwork, MH370 seemed to have vanished without a trace. For weeks, then months, the world waited. Families clung to hope. Investigators chased every lead, and theories began to swirl. Some debris eventually washed up, parts of a wing, some internal components, found on remote beaches in places like Reunion Island and the coast of Africa. These fragments confirmed one thing: MH370 had crashed. But where exactly and why remained maddeningly unclear. Satellite data suggested the plane had flown for hours after contact was lost, deep into the Indian Ocean, far from any radar or rescue. With no black box, no clear wreckage, and no final communication from the cockpit, the theories came fast. Was it a hijacking? A mechanical failure? A deliberate act? Everyone from aviation experts to conspiracy theorists weighed in. The Malaysian government and international investigators released reports, but no theory could be proven beyond doubt. The mystery stayed locked beneath the waves. To this day, the disappearance of MH370 is one of aviation's greatest enigmas. It sparked worldwide debate on aircraft tracking, leading to changes in how planes are monitored over oceans. But it also left behind heartbreak for the families who never got closure and for the public still wondering how a massive commercial aircraft could simply vanish in the 21st century. It's a haunting reminder that even with all our modern technology, the world can still keep its secrets. And somewhere, deep in the ocean's silence, MH370 waits, its story still unfinished. On December 21, 1988, just days before Christmas, Pan Am Flight 103 was cruising peacefully at 31,000 feet, carrying 259 people across the Atlantic from London to New York. It was a routine transatlantic journey, the kind thousands make each day, with passengers thinking about holiday reunions, business meetings, or just getting home. But that peace shattered in an instant. Without warning, the plane exploded over the quiet Scottish town of Lockerbie, sending wreckage raining down across 845 square miles of countryside. The explosion tore the Boeing 747 apart mid-air, one of the most chilling acts of aviation terrorism the world had ever seen. All 259 people on board were killed instantly, and as the fiery debris slammed into the homes and streets below, 11 Lockerbie residents also lost their lives in a moment that turned their small town into the center of an international catastrophe. The blast was traced to a suitcase bomb hidden inside a tape recorder packed with Semtex plastic explosives, which had been checked onto the plane in Malta, transferred through Frankfurt, and finally loaded onto Flight 103 in London. The attack wasn't just devastating, it was deliberate. After a massive investigation involving the FBI, Scottish authorities, and countless international experts, the blame eventually landed on two Libyan intelligence agents, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Lamine Khalifa Fhimah. Years of political wrangling followed before al-Megrahi was finally convicted in 2001 in a special Scottish court in the Netherlands. Libya's then leader Muammar Gaddafi initially denied involvement, but in 2003, his government accepted responsibility for the bombing, paid compensation to the victims' families, and started clawing its way out of global isolation. But even then, many questions lingered. Was al-Megrahi really guilty? Was there more to the story? Numerous conspiracy theories have swirled around Lockerbie ever since, ranging from CIA cover-ups to botched drug stings to claims of planted evidence. In 2020, the U.S. charged a third man, Abu Aguila Masood, believed to have built the bomb. He was eventually extradited and faces trial, showing how decades later, the wheels of justice are still slowly grinding on. Beyond the politics and legal twists, the human impact of Lockerbie has been immense. Many of the victims were American college students returning home for the holidays, including 35 students from Syracuse University. The university has since built a major memorial and scholarship program in their honor, keeping their stories alive. In Lockerbie itself, grief turned into resilience. And over the years, the town has embraced the victims' families as their own, building friendships, holding vigils, and tending memorials that dot the landscape. And yet, even today, Lockerbie remains a byword for tragedy, reminding the world how a single act of terror can send shockwaves across continents. The crash site has been visited by thousands, from political leaders to grieving relatives, all trying to understand how something so violent could happen in such a peaceful place. While aviation security has come a long way since 1988, thanks in part to the hard lessons learned from Lockerbie, the incident still feels painfully relevant, especially in a world where air travel remains a soft target for those who seek to make a statement through destruction. The legacy of Pan Am Flight 103 is one of heartbreak, yes, but also of tenacity, remembrance, and the quiet strength of communities that refuse to let terror define them. Decades have passed, but the echoes of that December evening still linger in the Scottish skies and in the hearts of those who will never forget.